All right, welcome to Decrypting the Law, your source for legal insights about the tokenized future. My name is Jason Somensatto. I am the Strategic Legal Counsel on the 0x Core team. Before we get started, a quick disclaimer. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, so please don't take anything that I say here as direct legal advice. All right, topic for today. I think it makes sense to talk about some AML issues that are worth looking out for in the open finance, decentralized finance world, and issues that I think might come up over time. Kind of before we jump in, why this is important. So, like when we think about traditional finance, every transaction that we're doing online through traditional financial systems is going to be intermediated through a company or business in some manner. And so it makes sense from a legal perspective if you're trying to implement some kind of anti-money laundering program to enforce those laws upon those intermediaries. The unique aspect about open finance and decentralized exchange like 0x is that the transactions are essentially peer-to-peer and are only intermediated through the smart contract code. There's not necessarily a business or a company sitting in between the transaction. So it becomes difficult to implement the same concepts of AML requirements on an intermediary since it is just ultimately a smart contract code. So I think looking forward, there's a possibility that there's going to need to be policy solutions that address this market. Obviously, right now it's a fairly small scale, and so I don't think we're at that point yet. But putting those policy issues aside for now, I kind of want to talk about the current state of the law and where I see some issues popping up. So first, I guess, let's just go ahead and set the stage for what we're talking about. And today I'm going to talk about specifically federal anti-money laundering laws. So in the US, we have a law called the Bank Secrecy Act, and the Bank Secrecy Act requires financial institutions to have AML programs in place whereby they monitor transactions and inform the government if there's something that is suspicious or that might constitute money laundering. And the list of entities that are considered financial institutions is actually fairly long. So you can go on FinCEN's website here, and they list out, obviously things like banks or securities broker-dealers. But concepts like money services businesses and casinos, and I should add that like under each of these, there's several subparts. And so ultimately you have a wide variety of companies and businesses that the federal government considers to be financial institutions that has to have some kind of AML program in place. The crypto industry has been primarily focused on this third one here, which is money services business, which there is a subpart of that called a money transmitter, which refers to companies that accept and transmit funds on behalf of customers. And so the most common way that this gets applied is to centralized exchanges. So right now, the vast majority of centralized exchanges that service the US and that are kind of the reputable names that you know about are money services businesses. So looking at this comes from Bitwise, which is a company that made an SEC report about exchange volume trading in crypto. And you can just see here that kind of the big names like Bitfinex and Coinbase and Bittrex and Kraken all are registered as money services businesses. Binance is not, although there are talks about them setting up a US entity that would be registered. But ultimately, the reason that those entities are money transmitters is because they are taking crypto and they're custodying it on behalf of customers. So when we get into the concept of open finance and decentralized exchange, it's not as clear that that same interpretation applies. And in fact, FinCEN, which is the primary regulator in the US that is overseeing money services businesses, has, and anti-money laundering laws in general, has put out guidance, and this comes from a May 2019 guidance. And so you can see under this section, there's actually a specific section relating to decentralized exchange, this section 5.1. And when they say CVC here, what they're meaning is basically cryptocurrency. But if you scan down kind of to this paragraph, you'll see that they talk about trading platforms that only provide a forum where buyers and sellers post bids and offers, and then the parties themselves settle any match transactions through an outside venue. Those aren't considered money transmitters. So, with 0x, there's a lot of different models that you can build on top of 0x, but kind of the standard open order book relayer probably falls within that exemption of not being a money services business. But I actually want to focus, and I guess before I move on, one thing I should say is if you're kind of interested in seeing any of these documents that I talk about, I have on the 0x webpage created a legal wiki and a legal library, and you can see I've kind of laid out all of these documents if you're ever interested in kind of digging deeper into this stuff. But the topic I want to kind of more directly focus on today has to do with a different part of that interpretation that FinCEN has put out. And it relates to how they distinguish between, on one hand, a company that is an exchanger, which is just kind of a term that they've made up, and somebody who is a cryptocurrency user. And the kind of key distinction that has developed through some of their guidance and other statements is that the idea that an exchanger is somebody who holds themselves out as a business that is willing to buy and sell cryptocurrencies from customers, as opposed to a user who is defined as someone who is trading for their own account. And I think why that distinction is interesting is because it's not all that complete when we think about how open finance is kind of creating a whole alternative financial system using these smart contract protocols, and how the variety of actors within these ecosystems can vary, widely, and don't just fit easily into a bucket of I'm a business that's I'm in the business of exchanging assets for customers, and I'm a user trading for my own account. And specifically, like when I think about this, I'm thinking about the broad category of like new forms of liquidity providers that inhabit these networks. So you can think of something like a market maker on 0x. And what do I mean when I'm saying like a market maker? So as opposed to somebody who might be buying ETH or some other token with the expectation that that token will go up in price and then they'll sell and make a profit off of the change in price of that asset, market making is a trading strategy in which generally the trader is going to try to be neutral to the fluctuation in price on the market, and instead stands ready to kind of buy or sell any asset. And instead, the profit strategy is focused on the spread with the trade. So, for example, if I'm a market maker and I am willing to buy ETH at 100 and sell ETH at 110, and I'm able to kind of constantly keep those orders out there and they get filled, then I don't have to expose myself to the fluctuations in ETH, and I can get that $10 spread between what people are buying and selling for. Moreover, you're seeing with kind of the higher level open finance protocols, other interesting business models that people can implement. For example, liquidating CDPs from MakerDAO, where these people are watching CDPs, seeing if they fall under the kind of margin maintenance line that they need to be, and then selling that collateral to ultimately make a profit. Similarly, like things like rebalancing with token sets. So, it's a protocol whereby the smart contract kind of keeps a portfolio of how a certain trading strategy, but ultimately there's times when those smart contracts have to go to the market and rebalance the portfolio. And, there is a potential business model in there whereby you could, make money off of trading across from these sets. And in those situations, it's not really easy to say, oh, yes, you're just a user, because ultimately these people are trying to build businesses. They're based on strategies. They're not necessarily just strategies dependent on, buying and selling an asset that they think is going to go up. But they're also not falling within the definition of an exchanger, where they're kind of a business that is out there, trying to find customers and just help them buy and sell cryptocurrencies. So, right now we're kind of in the early days of this discussion. Just recently, in the last year, less, I guess, FinCEN has started to kind of highlight these peer-to-peer exchangers that they're worried about, which generally fall under the category of somebody who's on a site like Local Bitcoins and is basically always willing to buy and sell an asset. And more often than not, there's concerns that these people are doing it for the specific reason of kind of avoiding KYC and AML laws. So you can see from this guidance, there's some explanation on that. They've recently brought a case against somebody in April of 2019 for kind of running such a business using, essentially a chat forum. But one of the, with the increased adoption of open finance, one of the things that I think you're going to have to get into is kind of figuring out where new categories of assets, where new categories of traders and businesses within these networks are, how they're going to be defined, and whether there's going to be AML requirements on them. I just want to, before we move on, go through an example from traditional finance that I think is really interesting and provide some insight. So after the financial crisis in 2008, the big financial legislation that got passed after that was called Dodd-Frank. And Dodd-Frank had something called the Volcker Rule that was included in it. So what the Volcker Rule said was that banks that receive federally insured customer deposits, so their customers give them money, and ultimately there's a backstop from the federal government on a certain level of those deposits, that those banks shouldn't be allowed to then go ahead and basically become proprietary traders on the market and, try to buy and sell stocks, or more, commonly was the issue, was complicated derivative products with these customer accounts. And so there was kind of a ban on prop trading included in there. But in the discussion on the creation of this rule, there was a lot of pushback, and mainly because one of the things that the banks do for customers is called market making, right? They want to be able to quote a market to their big customers. If somebody calls and says, hey, I'm interested in buying this, they can sell, here's what I buy it for, sell it for. And so the Volcker Rule ultimately included an exception for market making. So you're not allowed to prop trade, but you are allowed to market make. And that's very similar to what we think about when we look at this kind of money transmitter laws with crypto, of the difference between being an exchanger business and trading for your own account. And the interesting thing is there's not much to go on in the crypto world as to how to make that distinction. But in the traditional financial world, the discussions around that exemption and how to make that distinction are the subject of long books. So here you can kind of see the SEC's, one of the SEC people having, long speech on the market making exemption. If you go to the Federal Reserve's website, you can find just constant materials on the Volcker Rule and the market making exemption. And so I tend to think that if we're going to see an increase in open finance, there's going to end up being, one, this kind of discussion around just this distinction that FinCEN has put in place of like, how do you tell what the difference between trading for your own account is and, you know, a business that's kind of holding itself out there willing to trade in any asset. So, yeah, that's something I thought that was interesting. I guess I'll end by saying it's kind of hard for me to imagine open finance scaling to a really large size without some kind of, you know, regulation or maybe some identity or reputation system that can be leveraged to prevent kind of bad actors using the system. I just think that right now we're at a situation where we need kind of more time to figure out, like, how are these markets going to develop? What are going to be the kind of new types of financial institutions that prop up within these markets? And so it's just really interesting to keep an eye on that, and then to think about the current state of the law that's like doesn't really overlap nice and easily with the kind of players that you're seeing within these marketplaces. So, all right, that's it for our main topic today. If you didn't see our first video, it was actually the result of internal hackathon we did here at 0x. I worked on it with our community lead, Brent Oshiro. And one of the things that we try to do is take questions from the ecosystem and from the viewers. So if you definitely have a question, send it in. We actually received a question in response to my first video. So if you check it out here, you can see at the bottom, somebody by the name of Moose asked, is the 0x protocol going to be utilized to move ERC20 tokens that are considered securities? Good question, Moose. I think this question has kind of like two answers. One is from a technical perspective, 0x is kind of token agnostic. So ultimately, any token that fits an ERC20 format or an ERC721 can be traded over 0x. And so that means that, you know, if there is a tokenized security, people can, you know, technically use 0x for that purpose. From a legal perspective, the question gets a little bit more tricky. I think right now you're not seeing a ton of tokenized securities despite a lot of interest in the market. I think a lot of that has to do with regulation. But ultimately, there are some examples out there. There's teams like Harbor that have a really cool design whereby the token actually kind of has like a whitelist baked into it such that it can only be traded amongst people on that whitelist. But ultimately, you know, there's nothing to say that like somebody who holds a security can't sell it to somebody else that they know. So it would be very easy to leverage 0x to make such a transaction if, for example, you had a counterparty who was willing to buy your security and you wanted to sell it for DAI or something along those lines. Obviously, there's regulatory restrictions around like kind of who can be the participants in that transaction, but definitely one of those things like Harbor could set up an OTC product using 0x that I think would be awesome. More to the point of kind of like the 0x relayer listing securities, that gets a lot trickier because in that situation, essentially what you're doing is offering this security to the broad public. And right now, like to kind of be able to offer securities broadly, there's a lot of other regulatory restrictions that have to go on, and the platforms that offer them generally need to be registered. So, you know, there's multiple layers to the legal answer to your question, Moose, but, you know, my hope would be that people use 0x for, you know, those security transactions that they can in the kind of current environment, and then we'll have to wait to see if there kind of becomes a robust open marketplace that can be built on 0x for that purpose. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you find it interesting, obviously reach out. Hope you like the video. And yeah, until next time, keep it decentralized.